All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I hope everyone is having a fantastic day. My name is Tyler Braun. I'm the Director of Financial Planning with the Tranel Financial Group. This is a live webinar, so I have the president of our company, Jenna Bradford, on here as well. She'll be able to field any questions that come through. We're going to be talking about a really serious topic today that is impacting everyone in the United States and also globally, and that is inflation, that pesky inflation word that you keep hearing about. So since this is a live webinar, if you have questions that pop up, if I'm going to be going through a concept, today's webinar is strictly educational. I'll be talking about some different things to take advantage of here at the end, but really it's educational on what is inflation and how to overcome it. But if you have questions that do pop up as we go through this presentation, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. So if you move your cursor, you'll see a Q&A tab. You can click that button, type in any questions that you have. Jenna will be able to see those questions real time and can facilitate those over to myself. We will have some time at the end, as I expect this to be a 25 minute presentation. We'll have some time at the end to field specific questions and get a little more in detail with things that may be top of mind. So with that, we're going to get started here talking about inflation. So like any presentation, I always enjoy talking about what we're going to be covering, over the next 20 to 25 minutes. So number one, we're going to cover what is inflation, get you a definition. So when you see that term used, most people understand it, but I do want to give you an idea of what it is. We're going to talk about how it's measured. Where do we stand right now in the United States? How we got here, and then how we control it going forward, and then some things we can take advantage of and keep our lens aware of going forward. So number one, inflation, right? In simplest terms, if you were to break this down in its simplest terms, inflation is simply the cost and prices of goods and products increasing, or the purchase power of our money going down. So think about it, put yourself in the shoes of going to the grocery store. You see how expensive food items have become over the last 18-month time period in particular, right? So the cost of the goods, right, meaning the cost of buying that product has gone up exponentially. That's inflation. In addition to that, if you were to look at, what you could buy for $100 today versus what you could buy for $100 even 10 years ago, right? It's substantially different. So that's proof that the purchasing power of that money is diminishing or going down. So inflation, in simple terms, is just the cost of goods and services increasing and the purchasing power of our money decreasing. And I think that's a great depiction. You see that mother there pushing a cart up that mountain of money, right? It just shows what a lot of people are feeling right now in America. So there's different types of inflation, and this is where the education piece comes from. So when we break through this, most people think, well, it's inflation, everything goes up. But really, we have to look at the root cause. So the four key areas or four key strategies or types of inflation can be seen on the screen below. So you have what's called demand pull inflation. And what you're going to notice is you're going to read these and you're going to think, my goodness, yes, that's occurred. Yes, that's occurred. It's almost like a perfect storm of inflationary factors has weighed on top of each other the last 3 years. So a demand pull inflation is caused by an increase in demand or total spending in an economy. So put yourself back to the pandemic era, right? We saw an increase in spending occur post-pandemic. There was what was called pent-up demand that occurred when we were isolated in our homes, or we had a fear of missing out type mentality. People had extra cash flow because they weren't traveling as much, doing as much, and we started to see people go purchase, right? Hence, when you went to a car dealership, right, there's no cars available. Okay. The next one that we see there is a cost push inflation. And this is increased. This is basically inflation that has been increased because the price to produce the product has increased. So you think about it, this is a lot of times characterized as a service-based inflation, right? If it costs more money to manufacture a good, meaning manufacture a product, That means that that cost then gets handed down to the consumer, and that's an inflationary rise. The cost of that product increases. Same thing with labor wages. If we see labor wages increase, that means in order for a company to hit its profit margin, typically they're increasing the cost of that product, hence it gets more expensive. So that's a cost push inflation. Okay. Monetary inflation is caused when we see a huge increase in money supply, right? The last decade, we have seen our historic levels of money being printed because of our national debt. So think about that. Our national debt is at the highest levels ever. We continue to spend. This is not a Democrat versus Republican conversation. As a whole, the United States continues to spend at uncharacteristic levels, right? Unprecedented levels. And as we continue to do that, the central banks come in because we're not paying off our deficit and they're printing more money. Well, like anything else, if you put more money in circulation, the value of your currency decreases, which means your purchasing power decreases. That leads to inflation. And then you have what's called structural inflation. And this is a mismatch between the supply and demand. This occurred exceptionally at an exceptional rate during the pandemic. Right? We had a broken supply chain, meaning that we had ports that were shut down. We had people that were no longer able to go to work. We had this disruption in supply chain. So think about it. We had this huge demand for people to spend money, and we had no supply to fill that demand. So when you went to the grocery store, there were empty shelves. And if you think back, 3 or 4 years ago, there were many times you walked into a grocery store and you were saying you were limited to how much toilet paper you could buy, or how much milk you could purchase, or how much of a certain product you could even take home with you, because there was such a limited supply of that, which means anytime supply and demand, if there's 100 people trying to buy one thing, they're all willing to pay more money. Inflation starts to increase. What we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years is we've been impacted by each one of these at different times. And what it's creating is a very hard spiral for the Federal Reserve to unwind from, right? It's not like we can just fix the supply chain because the demand is still there. We also, in order to account for the rising demand, we've had to increase wages for, individuals all over the nation, which means that leads to more raises. And then we continue to run a deficit, so the government has had to continue to print money. So all of these things have actually built on one another. And it's made it very difficult for Fed Chairman Powell and the Federal Reserve to try and control just one of these factors when all four are causing pressures. So as you can see the pictures here, I want you to think in a company standpoint, right? Or even from a reporting standpoint, inflation can be impacted in many different descriptions and pictures. So in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you can see a cup of coffee and how much it's increased since 1970. So in 1970, a cup of coffee in this description was 25 cents. In 2020, it was about $1.59. Right now, if you went to Starbucks in particular, we call it $5. It's probably $5 or $6 for that same cup of coffee, right? It just shows how, for that same product, how much more money you have to spend. So certain products and certain companies will increase the cost of a product, as reflected here, but others are hitting you with inflation through what's called shrinkflation. And that's depicted on the picture in the lower right-hand corner. So you can see a burger right then listed had 3 patties and was a huge burger versus a burger now for the same price. Both are $4.99. So on paper, they're saying we never increased our price. What they did is they shrink the product that you're receiving for the same cost. Right. So that's one of those hidden features. You think about like a Gatorade bottle. My kids play sports. So if they were holding a Gatorade bottle, it used to be that you would look at the bottle and say, we got 16 fluid ounces. Well, now most of those bottles are 12 fluid ounces. They just reshaped the bottle so less fluid actually fits inside of it. So there's different ways that they're shrinking the product, but keeping the cost the same. And it's not necessarily a way to deceive the consumer, But what it is just a cost saving metrics for them saying, hey, if we're giving you less product for the same amount of money, obviously that's a way or a form of inflation as well. So there's different ways inflation is going to impact you. The biggest question I get from people is they say, Tyler, what is the easiest way to track inflation? And if you're watching the news, one of the most specific pieces that you would hear or terms you would hear is called CPI, Consumer Price Index. Okay, and what that does is it looks at all of the data over the last 12 months, and it says what is the change in the cost of specific goods. And there's a lot that goes into that. Most people think with the CPI, well, they're just looking at whatever inflation was 12 months ago and whatever they're looking at today. No, there's certain percentages that go into that calculation where they're saying housing represents 23% of that metric, right? Food and non-alcoholic beverages represent 16%. You can see, what they would deem recreational or cultural expenses, 13%, transportation. You can see it all the way down to communication, which is the smallest metric. So the driving piece behind the CPI is a culmination of all these different weighted percentages and how much they're impacting things. So the first piece that you look at on here is you say housing. Has housing increased the past 12 months? And the answer for most people is absolutely 100%. Housing has increased exponentially. Well, if housing is 23% weighting of the CPI data, and housing is increased by 5.5% the last 12 months, right? That's going to drive inflation higher. Hence, you're starting to see higher interest rates to limit the demand for housing to start bringing that down, right? The Federal Reserve and the government do not want inflation to stay elevated. Food and non-alcoholic beverages are the same way, right? The cost of food, right, has increased exponentially the last 12 months. It's increased exponentially the last 18 months in particular. But all the way down through, each individual sector has its own specific weighting. So if somebody said, well, health costs were flat. Well, health costs are only 6% of the CPI weighting, right? So it's not going to move the needle a lot. Food and housing is going to move the needle the most for having an impact on inflation going forward. So what's interesting about the CPI report, as I said before, it's a 1-year number. They look over the last 12 months and they say, based on the last 12 months of data, this is the percentage increase or decrease that we have seen. Inflation works like a stair step, and this is where people get frustrated with the numbers per se. So I want you to think back to pre-pandemic. If you went to Home Depot or Menards previous to the pandemic and you wanted to buy an 8-foot 2x4, and you went and just said, I'm going to get a standard 8-foot 2x4, it was about $1.50 to $1.90 for an 8-foot 2x4 at that time. During the pandemic, the price of an 8-foot 2x4 jumped from $1.50 almost to $9 per board. Now it's decreased exponentially, and right now it's about $3 to $3.50 for that same board. So they're celebrating that it is decreased by 300%, and that's what you hear about from the lumber cost. But remember, it's still up 250% from where it started. So inflation's like a stair step. It increases, it flatlines, it increases, it flatlines, and it continues. And we get used to that new norm. And that becomes frustrating for people because they say, well, it used to be a certain way. It most likely will never get back to that certain point. So where do we stand right now? You can see two different lines on the graph in front of your screen. Okay, the first is the CPI report, less food and energy. This is what's reported on the news. And what's interesting about that is they're going to say, well, we're not going to take into account food and energy when we do this calculation because that's the most volatile sector that we see, right? The federal government has no control over the weather. So they're saying we can't report on this because if it's a really cold winter, you're going to see energy prices spike because there may be a shortage on natural gas or a shortage on LP gas, liquid propane, right? Food is going to spike because we can't control if there's an avian flu somewhere and all of a sudden chicken goes through the roof, or beef prices rise dramatically because of a drought somewhere, right? So they say we remove that and we look at the CPI report of all items, and that gives us a better indication, or excuse me, the less food and energy gives us an indication of what they would call more core CPI, right? Core CPI is looking at it saying, these are the numbers that are more dependable to make our decisions going forward. Okay. When we look at the CPI of all items, that includes food and energy, and that includes some of those more volatile areas. That's going to give you a track record of where those specific pieces are moving. For a lot of people, it's hard to see an inflation number at 3% because in the back of their mind, they're saying, how the heck is inflation at 3%? But I went to the grocery store and I bought 4 items and it cost me $150. How does that make sense, right? Well, because the metric you're looking at for measuring does not include food and energy in most cases, right? So if you take that into account, inflation's actually considerably higher. Inflation peaked last July, which we're going to talk about here in just a second, but inflation peaked last July, or July of 2022 now, at almost 9% in the CPI metric. And that's what you can see here listed on the screen. We hit over 9% in inflation in the beginning of 2022 into the end of 2023. That's the highest level since 1970, when a term called stagflation set in, right? We saw hyperinflation where inflation stayed at a considerably elevated level for almost a 5-year time period. So with that being said, we have seen inflation decrease since that time period. And the reason it has decreased is because we've started to increase interest rates, right? We've made things more expensive for individuals, which I'll talk about here strategically. The Federal Reserve has done that. And they've done that on purpose to allow the economy to slowly, or what they call strategically, cool down, which means there's less cash flow, which means there's less demand to buy goods. If less people are buying products, the cost of those products start to reside, right, or subside. So when we look at inflation from where we were, you can see pre-pandemic, we were running where the Fed's target inflation rate of 2% is right around where we were hovering. And during the pandemic, you see inflation actually went negative because we were printing so much money and people had pent-up demand. We weren't able to go places and spend money. Inflation started to decrease. The federal funds rate was almost at zero. And then all of a sudden, post-pandemic, people said, enough of this. I'm going to start spending money. I'm going to start traveling. The government put stimulus in people's pockets. They started changing their spending habits. They started spending more. And all of a sudden, the desire and demand to buy product went through the roof. People had extra savings and cash on the sidelines, and inflation went right with it. Now what we've seen is we've had to start to strap down and decrease some of that spending because things have gotten more expensive. And inflation has started to taper off, but it's being very persistent, which we've seen in the last few CPI reports here for February and now for March. So, most people say, well, how did we get to this high inflation number, right? How did inflation increase at the fastest pace since 1970? So we had an increase in demand for products. And all of us are probably guilty of this, right? We went through the pandemic. It was a very difficult time for everyone. And most people had some form of pent-up demand. What we also saw is people had an increase in cash flow. So, for a 3-year period, student loans were in forbearance, meaning you didn't have to make a payment on those loans as long as they were held by the federal government. So the average consumer saved $500 a month that they weren't making in payments, and they decided they're going to start spending that money. And as they spent it, the demand for product became higher and higher. Stimulus checks went out. We also had forbearance on, debt repayment with regards to your mortgage. There was issues with tenants and landlords where tenants were not required to make payments and for a period of time. So most of that has worked its way through the system now, but we had over $4.3 trillion, 4.3 trillion with a T, in money that was printed and infused into the economy. And that is the increase in the money supply. So when we look at that, going into this, the national debt was right around $30 trillion. We printed an additional 12% of money and added it to the money supply during that time period. That's a lot, right? That's huge. And that's really where we're starting to feel some of the pain of inflation, is because we infuse so much money into the economy and we put it in the hands of consumers. And by doing that, we have no control. When I say we, the Federal Reserve has no control over the spending, and we saw a huge uptick in spending. We had supply chain issues. As I said before, during the pandemic, much of the supply chain was shut down, so we couldn't get product here fast enough. And when it was here, we had 100 people looking to buy the same item, so the cost of that item increased. We're still dealing with supply chain issues right now. Some of it has to do with the, unrest that's occurring, overseas, whether that's Russia invading Ukraine, whether that's some of the Middle East issues. There's also issues that are being disrupted on the supply chain through the Red Sea right now. You don't hear a lot about it, but it's occurring, in over $25 trillion of product on an annual basis go through that supply route. So we're having some supply chain issues. There is still a large amount, not as much, but a large amount of pent-up consumer demand. That's people that wanted to buy cars, that's people that wanted to buy houses, etc. As I had said before, the stimulus that was printed during the pandemic is a large contributor to this, and post-pandemic, and then rising wages, right? I want everyone to make as much money as they absolutely can, but when we see wages increase at a rapid pace, product increases with it, because companies are going to continue to work on hitting their profit margins. So what they're doing is they're raising the cost of the product, right? When you saw, minimum wage and different things like that at some of these fast food restaurants increase, that's great for the individual that's working, right? It gives them more of a livelihood, but you've also seen now the cost of that product increase with it. You go to McDonald's and get a cheeseburger meal, and you're looking at, $11 to $13 now on a normal basis, where, 5 years ago it was 5 to 6. So you're seeing those rising wages increase also, inflation at the same time. So how do we control inflation, right? How do you control this? So I'm sitting here educating you on what inflation is. How do you control it? So there's really three key metrics that the government and the Federal Reserve, they're two separate entities. Okay, what's interesting is the Federal Reserve is not the federal government. Okay, so as we look through that piece, there's three pieces or chess pieces that can be moved around. Number one, you could decrease governmental spending. So in short, stop printing so much money, right? We have a huge national deficit. We are devaluing our own currency by printing more money. What it also does, though, by printing money and inflation rising, is it makes that 34 trillion seem smaller. And I know that sounds backwards when I say it, but think about it. If you own a home, and let's say you buy a house for $400,000 and your mortgage is $300,000. Well, if your home value increases because inflation goes up, and inflation on a home is a hard asset, and let's say your house is now worth $1 million, you still only have $300,000 in debt. So by increasing, your assets that you hold, the government can increase their assets that they hold. They can actually, make that debt look smaller through inflation. That's one of the pieces that are there, but that's a different topic and a different subject for a different time. But really what needs to happen to help control this is we need to balance a budget. And this is not a Democrat or Republican thing. We just need to do a better job as a nation balancing a budget and stop devaluing the dollar at the pace that we're doing. That's hard, especially during an election year, because that's a hard decision to say, hey, we're going to cut different programs or cut different things to balance that budget when you're trying to get elected one way or another. So that's very difficult. Okay. The second option, which also people do not like, is increased taxes, right? By increasing the tax, right, what you're doing is you're reducing a person's spending power. So it sounds backwards, but if people have less money available, their desire to buy products goes down. And if demand to buy something goes down, there's an overabundance of inventory. Think about it, supply and demand. You have a bunch of product that nobody wants to buy. They start to discount the cost of that product, right? It starts to come down. So if people don't have the same spending power they have because they're paying 5% or 10% more in taxes, that also can help reduce inflation. I personally don't like that option, and I'm sure many of you don't like that option either. But it is something to be aware of, is we could in the future. So this is talking about the future. We could, with the deficit we have and inflation running the way that it has, see an increase in taxes. We need to plan for that. Okay. The third and most common way of going through and talking about inflation is when inflation is too high, the Federal Reserve will typically increase or raise interest rates to help slow down the economy. It sounds so backwards because who wants the economy to slow down, right? Inflation is a sign that the economy is overheating or growing at a pace that is higher than a sustainable pace long term. So the Federal Reserve is targeting a 2% increase on inflation per year. So they're targeting a goal saying we want the cost of goods and services to go up by an average of 2% per year because we feel that is sustainable. And we feel that the gross domestic product, our GDP, can grow at a larger pace than inflation. That's a healthy inflation number that they're targeting. If the economy is overheating, that means that there is more money in demand than there is product available to service that demand. So think of homes, right? There's a limited number of homes and a lot of home buyers. So the cost of that product increases. What the Federal Reserve does by increasing interest rates is they're making it more expensive for you to buy certain things. They're limiting your spending power. So for example, if you want to buy a house and they increase interest rates, 3 years ago, a 30-year fixed mortgage was 2.5%. Right now, the average 30-year fixed mortgage is about 7.25%. So that's a 4.75% increase in interest, which means for the same amount of money, you can afford less home. So what it does is it starts to get you to a point where you can't afford that higher amount as individuals. And what that does is it starts to bring down that demand or desire. And in return, you start to see those prices decrease. And remember, if home prices start to decrease, that's 23% of the CPI metric, right? You start to see that fall fairly rapidly. Just a reminder, if you guys have any questions, because I know I'm diving into the weeds here, if there's any questions, please pick that or click that Q&A tab at the bottom, and I'm happy to go further into detail as well. So what to expect in the future, right? I've been talking through inflation, and really what I want to do here is dive through. There are opportunities that we're going to be having that I'm going to talk about here in the next slide. But really, if you were to say, what if we're looking through the rest of 2024 and into 2025, I would tell you to anticipate higher interest rates for a longer period of time. So if you, after this meeting, if you get bored and you want to look at Google, type in the S&P 500, or SPY would be an index, and you can look from October till the end of 2024 or end of 2023. So from October of last year to the end of the year last year, and you're going to see companies just went straight up in the market. And the reason they went up is that's when Fed Chairman Powell announced that they were looking to cut interest rates in 2024. They were anticipating to cut interest rates up to 3 times in 2024. Markets, businesses, and individuals like lower interest rates because it's less cost to do business and there's more purchasing power, right? You have more of your dollars then if you're paying less interest to a credit card or to a mortgage company, etc. With interest rates coming out the way that they are, with inflation rates being reported in January, February, and March, we have not seen inflation decrease. We've actually seen it increase and now accelerate. So with that being said, the inflation number in January was 3.1. In February, it was 3.2. And now in March, it jumped to 3.8. So we look at that, it not only increased, it started to accelerate. Now, some of that has to do with food prices, some of it has to do with energy prices, but I'm talking core numbers where you look at that core CPI, right? We've seen an increase over that 3-month time period. So what the Fed has had to do is they've had to pivot. And that's where you've started to see some volatility the last month or so in the market, is because companies were anticipating rate cuts. And now they're saying, nope, the Fed is saying we're going to be keeping rates at an elevated level for the foreseeable future. Now, does that mean a year? Does that mean 6 months? No one knows, right? What they're saying is we're looking at these metrics and we're going to keep rates higher for the foreseeable future to make sure that we're combating inflation so it does not turn into stagflation or hyperinflation. So we will most likely see rates decrease at some point. I just don't know if that's 6 months or a year. So we need to plan accordingly because there's some opportunities with that. Okay. Second piece is hard assets should continue to appreciate for the short term. Okay. I don't have a crystal ball, but they should. So think about it. If home prices go up and you own a home, right, your home's worth more money. So what's interesting about that is inflation is actually a tax on the middle class or lower middle class. People that have assets and that have accumulated wealth, inflation can make them more wealthy. And think about that. From a net worth standpoint, if you own assets and those assets go up in value because of inflation, even though you're not selling them, on paper, you're worth more money, right? So it can increase your net worth. For those individuals that don't yet have the assets, it becomes extremely difficult because they're climbing uphill. So think about it. Now it costs more interest for a new person or a younger person to buy a home. So it's more expensive from a mortgage rate standpoint. Banks are more heavily regulated right now because of the way that everything is situated with inflation and interest rates and so forth. So it's more of a down payment, and the house costs more money on top of that, right? So it's very difficult to break into that. But those that have assets, like many of you on this call, your net worth has actually increased due to inflation. We could see a possible increase in taxes. We have a deficit as a nation. So if you were to ask most people, do you think taxes will be higher, 5 years from now or 10 years from now than they are today? The answer is probably yes. So we need to plan for that as well. And then what we're starting to see and what the Federal Reserve actually wants to see is a rise in unemployment. So when I say a rise in unemployment, we look at that and that's a negative for the overall economy. But what the Federal Reserve is saying is we are at such a high job market, meaning that we are at a full job market, meaning our unemployment rate is at 4% or less. That's historically fantastic. That's a historical low for unemployment, which is a good sign for the overall economy. The Federal Reserve wants to see a rise in unemployment. And the reason they do that is because wage increases will start to decrease. And if wage increases decrease, there's less money going around, meaning you have less purchasing power, less demand for product, and then you start to see the costs come down on those products. So inflation starts to ease. So that's one of the pieces that we are monitoring as well. Okay. So where we see opportunities through this, and if you're taking notes, we can do an additional seminar or webinar in the future here to get through more of these specifics. I just want to get the wheels turning from an educational standpoint. Number one, you need to continue to invest so you can keep pace with inflation. So there's a lot of people out there that say, well, what should we do? I just want to sit on the sidelines. Well, you need to get some form of return. If you have your money sitting in checking, in a Chase account or wherever, and you're getting 0.01% and inflation is going up by 5%, right? You've literally lost 5% on your money, right? It's worth 5% less than it was the year before. So you need to be getting some form of return, even on your lazy money, to keep pace with inflation. Okay. That's where you talk to your advisor about that. You need to be able to look right now. We have a huge opportunity. And this is where you should be talking to your advisor as well, or talking to us about this, is interest rates are elevated, and they're elevated for a period of time with the anticipation, and the Fed has already announced that they want to cut interest rates in the future. We need to look at how do we take advantage of elevated interest rates right now, because they may not be elevated next year. They may not be elevated 2 years from now. How do we take advantage of some elevated interest rates with limited risk? And there's ways to do that, right? So that's an exciting opportunity that's out there. You need to also look at companies that you need, regardless of the state of the economy, that can also appreciate with inflation, right? So we talked about energy and utilities, right? Those are one of the companies that if inflation goes up, right? Think of a company like Waste Management. For gosh sakes, I mean, that's one of the most recession resistant holdings out there. If Waste Management, if you're a garbage, you always need your garbage collected regardless of what's occurring and regardless of the cost. In addition to that, most of the waste, or most of your garbage collection facilities are paid for through your taxes that you're paying to your municipality, right? So you're paying taxation. They have an agreement to service a certain neighborhood that is paid, and then they budget in their increases through those raises. So you have a built-in raise that occurs with inflation right in there. So there's certain areas you can look at and say, hey, this is going to appreciate with inflation. How do we take advantage of that and make sure that we're benefiting from this rising cost of goods and services? And then, as I said before, continue to dollar cost average. That means don't stop doing what you're doing, because those assets will continue to grow long term. If you're adding to your 401k, keep doing it, right? Keep adding through. What you need to look at is what you're adding into and possibly tweaking that, but continue to add into those accounts, continue to take your dividends and buy more shares with those dividends, continue to, build that wealth, because we need to keep pace with inflation as things get more expensive, because that's one of the hidden costs or hurdles for most retirees is how do we keep pace with going to the grocery store and needing more money every single month than what we needed the month before, because the cost of goods and services is more expensive, right? So we need to be taking advantage of these different pieces. So with that being said, I'm already at about 35 minutes here. I went a little bit longer than anticipated, so my apologies there. Jenna, do you want to jump on? Do we have any questions at all that we can go through for clients?
I have one question that I actually think is a great question. So thank you, Jerry, for asking this. It says, how time sensitive are inflation concerned recommended actions? In other words, what is the time frame we have to implement the actions to counter inflation? Of course, a presidential election year may have some implications with it, which is a fair point.
Right. I don't have a crystal ball, but you're not under the, you shouldn't lose sleep at night saying, hey, I have to do something tomorrow, but you do want to start taking action on some of this here within the next month or so. The reason I say that is no one knows exactly when the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates. Most likely, right? So if you were to look at the odds, right, they have statistics that say each month, what are the odds that they'll cut interest rates? When I looked at that this morning, the next Fed meeting will be in June. There's only a 6% chance they're going to cut odds in June, or cut rates in June. So that's pretty low, right? In July, originally there was a 72% chance at the beginning of the year they would cut rates. That's down under 45% now, which means there's a higher probability they'll keep rates where it is versus cutting rates. And the longer you wait, the higher that percentage is that they will cut interest rates, right? So no one really knows the exact month. A lot of that depends on the economy and things that we see, but you do want to start looking at pieces. Rates could go higher. Statistically, we're not necessarily seeing that piece. The Fed has been pretty consistent with their message of keeping rates where they're currently at for the foreseeable future, which means we want to take advantage of rates where they're at, knowing that the odds in the future are they're going to go down. So we want to take action before they do decrease rates, is the short answer to your question, Jenna. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
That was the only question we had for today, which was a great question. So
Perfect. Perfect. So if anyone on here has additional questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or our team here. We're happy to help and go through those in detail. This is something everybody's feeling with inflation every day, but there is some opportunities here that we can continue to make sure you're maximizing everything you should be off of it going forward. And like I said, please let me know if you have any questions. We're happy to help.